All right, good evening, folks. My name is Hector Quinones. I have the privilege of pastoring the Warwick Seventh-day Adventist Church, where we worship God. We're located at 92 South Road in Warwick, and we welcome you. We welcome you to part two, The Right to Be Wrong. The Right to Be Wrong. We have with us Todd McFarland and our Religious Liberty Director, Kagi Gibbons, for the Warwick Seventh-day Adventist Church. And before beginning, we'd like to offer up a prayer and a sincere regrets to our conference president and his family, the Manders family and their extended family. Today, in case you have not heard, today, July 11th, Pastor Manders' mother has passed away. We are confident in her name written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And while we are saddened, we do not grieve in despair. We do nonetheless grieve because death is an enemy. And we praise God that one day soon Jesus Christ will return and he will put away death in every shape, form, and manner. We praise God for that. And we know that that day will come. And as far as we understand with prophecy, day is fast approaching. So before beginning and handing off our time to Kagi to welcome Mr. McFarland, why don't we bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father God, we pray for the Manders family. And Father, we would be remiss if we thought that they were the only ones suffering this day. For we know, Father, that there are many suffering in and around the world. And many are longing for that day when you will come and put away all death, all pain, all sorrow. Indeed, Father, everything that death has touched, everywhere that sin has left its fingerprints on. We long, Father, for the day that you will put an end to that. Until that day, Father, give us the hope of your second coming. Give us the hope of your second coming, and with it, the resurrection. Give us the hope of that second coming, that resurrection, and that day when we shall say goodbye to death, for it shall be no more. Please be with all of those grieving, all of those mourning, near and far, related to us, and those that we just know from a distance. Please be with them. And Father, we pray for the day that this COVID-19 may be a distant memory, but not the moments that we had to remember you and to see how great thou art. God, please bless us, is our prayer, and comfort us in Jesus' name. Amen. Kagi, I leave you with the time, and then Todd. God bless.
Thank you, Pastor. Welcome, Todd. Welcome back to the Warwick Church for the second time in one day.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let me introduce you to the viewing audience for those who aren't familiar with you. Todd McFarland is an attorney, also known as an associate general counsel at the General Conference. He's a church lawyer involved in his area of practice, mostly religious liberty and religious discrimination issues. His department's biggest clients are the GC and the North American Division, but they also involve themselves in other legal affairs, advising different bodies and different groups of the church throughout all of its variegated branches. We now welcome Todd McFarland with a series of questions. Todd?
Hi, thanks for having me. We are going to take some questions today that have been presented, but I think to begin with, what Pastor Quinones had asked me to do is to talk about a recent United States Supreme Court decision called Bostic. And so I thought I would just give a little narrative on that and talk about it, and then from there take some questions, if that's okay. So as and again, this was what I was asked to talk on. So this is, only probably related to Bermuda sort of tangentially, since it was U.S. Supreme Court decision. But what the question had been is, in the United States, we have employment discrimination laws, I think, as most countries do, and we have several of those. But the main one is a law called Title VII. It came out of what's known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That was the big civil rights legislation that happened during the civil rights era in the United States. I think Martin Luther King was one that he was pushing for. It was one that Kennedy had introduced, and then after he was assassinated, Justice Johnson then got it passed, and it took effect in 1964. And the employment part of that affected a lot of American life. Is called Title VII. And this law protected a number of different areas. The biggest, of course, was race, color, and national origin. That was what was the sort of impetus of it. They also, though, added religion to there as well. Religion was another protected category, and it's actually the religious discrimination that I work on the most, namely in the form of religious accommodation. But they also added the word sex to the protection. That it was illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex. How and why that happened is really a matter of great debate. There seems to be some indication that it was done by some people who opposed it and were not in favor of the law, and just thought it was so ridiculous that you couldn't discriminate in the basis of sex in the workplace that they would add it and kill the bill. There were some other people, though, who felt no, they weren't necessarily in favor of the bill, but were really opposed to gender and sex discrimination, and so they supported it. But regardless, that was one of the legal bases that it was illegal to discriminate on. And so that has, of course, a number of implications. So it meant that you couldn't, reserve certain jobs for men and certain jobs for women. And it also meant, because of a case back in the 1980s, that you couldn't stereotype when it comes to jobs. So, for instance, if a woman didn't act like a woman should, and didn't meet certain stereotypes as far as maybe wearing makeup or feminine clothes or jewelry and so forth, you couldn't discriminate against her. It also got held that it was the basis why sexual harassment lawsuits, you've heard of that, why it's illegal to sexually harass someone. That comes from the anti-discrimination provisions on gender or sex, as it's called in the law. So that the idea of what it means not to discriminate on the basis of sex has been developing for some time. Well, the last few years, really starting in around 2015 and well before that as well, there had become the idea that this protected not only what you normally would think of sex discrimination, for instance, not hiring a woman to do a job that you historically perceived to be for men, but it also protected what's known as sexual orientation and gender identity. And that was because it said, listen, the argument being is, if a man is in the workplace and he is married to a woman, that's okay. You allow them to be married. You don't discriminate against that. And I'm really talking about the secular workplace right now. I'll get to religious organizations in a second, but just think about, working at a General Motors plant. But if the woman is married to a woman, then that's just treated differently. And so what you're discriminating on is the basis of the person's sex. Because if they were a different sex, so if she was the same employee but a man, it would be okay for her to be married to a woman, and of course vice versa. And so that was the idea that, and where it came from, and sort of the theory that said that sexual orientation was protected under Title VII. And this idea first came up in the Obama administration as far as some guidance and so on. It made it through the courts of appeals, and some of the lower courts in the United States had agreed with that and found it, and some of the courts of appeals had disagreed with it. And so the case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then also there was two cases put together. Another one had to do with gender identity. In that situation, former man, male to female, named, I'm going to forget the first name here, but Harris was the last name. or I'm sorry, Harris was the deployer, Harris Funeral Homes, had transitioned from female to male. I'm sorry, male to female. And was fired as a result of that. And the funeral home said, listen, we just can't accommodate that. You know, we hired you as a man, you're now dressing as a woman, and we just can't do that here. And so both of those cases went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what the U.S. Supreme Court decided was that is illegal in a 6-3 decision written by Justice Gorsuch, one of the more conservative justices, and Justice Roberts joining, said that is illegal under current existing federal law. And both sexual orientation discrimination and gender identity status discrimination were against the law. And that means that in all parts of the United States and its territories where federal law applies, you can't discriminate against a person based on either their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And that is not a new concept in the United States, because many states had laws like that already. About half the states already had laws that protected sexual orientation and gender identity in the workplace, and then the rest of them did not. But now it's the law of the land. And so that was something of a surprise. Most people didn't think that this conservative court would go in that direction. But what Justice Gorsuch said was, listen, we really don't know what they thought at the time when they did this, what Congress' intent was, but what we're bound with is the language they used. And the language they used makes this illegal. And, you know, he basically conceded, as did the other side, that this wasn't the intent of Congress. It's hard to believe something that was illegal at the time and had a lot of societal approbation would really have ever passed Congress. I mean, even the most liberal of members of Congress at the time probably would not have been supportive of this. But they said, you know what, this is what they wrote. And of course, because this is a statutory, just a statute, Congress could, it's not going to, but Congress could change it if they didn't agree with it. So that is the law of the land right now. And so the question then becomes, you know, what does this mean for religious organizations and religious entities? It's pretty clear that when it comes to the workplace and the sexual orientation side of things, that is illegal now in secular workplaces, and most secular workplaces, even ones that are religiously held, probably aren't going to try to push against this. But with religious organizations, especially ones like the Seventh-day Adventist Church, do have conduct standards. And so, you know, the official position of the Adventist Church is you're not disqualified from being a member or even working for the church just because you're same-sex attracted. But what there is a conduct standard that is applied that requires people to be married, and marriage is defined by marriage between one man and one woman. And that's very clearly, defined in our documents in our church manual. And that's the only type of marriage we recognize. And then sexual activity outside of that marriage, whether it be gay or straight, is prohibited. And so the question then becomes, can the church apply its conduct standards to its employees? That's going to be litigated. We believe, in the advice that OGC and Adventist Risk Management have given, is that they can, and we're going to sort of continue that approach for our employees. But that's going to be litigated. Now, I do want to stop here and say one thing that's different, and that is there's a different set of laws that apply for people like ministers and teachers. And when it comes to pastors and teachers, there really is no question now that these anti-discrimination laws don't apply to a church. So if you're talking about a pastor or a teacher, and I'm mainly talking about like primary education and secondary, higher ed becomes a little bit more iffy, then there's just no question that something called the ministerial exception kicks in. And therefore the churches are free to do what they need to do there. But it does raise an interesting issue for when the church employs individuals, especially non-Adventist and non-ministerial and teaching roles. You know, what is the conduct standards they can have? And right now, the Adventist Church is, of course, taking the position that we can apply our conduct standards. Now, we do need to do that on a consistent basis. And so, you know, and the reality is, you know, the church has disciplined a lot more employees who are straight for adultery and fornication and so on than they ever have gay employees. And so this is not something that's new to church as an employer, making sure and holding its employees accountable, for their conduct standards, and not just in areas of, sexual morality, but other areas too, Sabbath keeping, alcohol use, drug use, etc. In the church, so this is not something new to the church. So it will, though, create some challenges for us going forward in that, it's just going to give one more avenue that the church can be attacked in court on. And we're just going to have to be more careful, especially when dealing with our non-ministerial employees. One of the questions that came was, do I think that the Supreme Court, sort of stretched the canons of statutory interpretation to get to this? And, I think I think it was the wrong decision. And with the qualification here, not because protecting gay rights is wrong. In fact, the church actually supports that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But, when Congress passes a law, they are bound by the words they use, but they need to be understood in the context that they were set in. And it's just really inconceivable that the language they used in 1964, meant what it's been applied to now, is sort of a different way of interpreting statutes, a different way of understanding language, and a different way of applying it. There's two very different things. Also, it's not like the Supreme Court has always just taken the literal words of Congress and applied them without regard to their implications or what Congress intended. Just a few years ago, in a case called King versus Burwell, the Supreme Court went out of its way to hold up the Affordable Care Act in its market exchanges, and really just ignored the plain text that Congress had written to try to protect it, because they'd made, just quite frankly, a drafting error, and they weren't willing to live with the consequences. And there's a lot of examples of that. And I think this is a situation where the court should have said, we understand the statutory interpretation, and it's not a frivolous argument. And it, perhaps even if you took it sort of by its most literal meaning, it's one that has some appeal. But we've got to understand, what Congress wrote in the context, in the way that they wrote it at the time that they wrote it. And there was no way that the idea of sex and sex discrimination meant sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination when they passed this. And so I think they should have been more faithful to what Congress intended. However, I did mention that the Adventist Church has supported protection for gay and lesbian individuals and transgender individuals in the workplace. And that's true. We have been behind and on the record now for a year or more on something called Fairness for All, and been working on it much longer than that. And that's a law that would have, before the Supreme Court took its action, made clear that sexual orientation and gender identity were protected in federal law, but also given robust religious exemptions. And sort of balance those interests. So it meant in the secular workplace, which is the vast majority of the workplace, that gays and lesbians and transgender individuals would have been protected, but that then churches could have upheld and been very clear that they could uphold their conduct standards for their employees. That law is still pending, and well, it's probably not going to pass this Congress. We hope that it will in some future Congress, or at least parts of it maybe get implemented into to a different bill. So again, I think it's important to understand, for the Adventist Church and other conservatives, not all, but others, it wasn't that we were opposed to the, at least the big picture outcome here, which is protecting gays and lesbians in the workplace, but we just felt that it should have been done through the congressional and legislative process and not through the courts. So I think that's pretty well the narrative I wanted to go through. As far as the questions, we're going to see where this lands. This is going to be litigated pretty heavily. I can tell you, I'm a member of some plaintiffs organizations, and they certainly feel like that the limitations on religious organizations are much narrower than we probably do. I think they're probably most first worried about like closely held companies owned by religious individuals, rather than sort of a mainstream church. I think they also are probably more concerned about religious organizations that hire a lot of individuals just from the community and don't really hire within their faith. The Adventist Church, at least in a lot of its contexts, do try to hire Adventist or primarily Adventist, and I think that will give us some protection. So, Kagi, I guess if you're taking the lead, or Pastor Kionis or whoever, that was sort of the narrative I wanted to give and give some background on what the Supreme Court did and where we're at. And maybe from now, if there's questions on Bostock, or I know there's a lot of other questions we got here, we can move on to those.
I think you pretty well covered the questions on Bostock, or Bostock as you call it. Just have one other one, and that is, how muscular are gay rights becoming in the US and elsewhere? And what do you think that portends for religious liberty?
Well, certainly in Western societies, LGBT rights are on the rise. In fact, have significant protections, not just in law but also in society. And the vast majority, or I should say, the majority of Americans, support protection of gay and lesbian people in the workplace. It's also crossed the threshold for supporting same-sex marriage, which of course we've had since 2015. In a lot of other areas. And it has certainly made religious liberty more challenging in the sense that, religious liberty used to be viewed as something that was a bipartisan issue and something that both the left and the right could support. It's now, unfortunately, being more and more viewed as just a Republican issue and as an excuse, in some people's minds for just discriminating. And that's a problem. And that's something we have to push back on. Which is one of the reasons the church supported Fairness for All.
Thank you. Pastor, did you have a question?
Yes, actually, some questions are coming in even now. Todd, I think it's imperative that before we move on to maybe some other questions, let's try to unpack how it could be that the Seventh-day Adventist Church would be in favor of sexual rights, transgender rights, LGBTQ rights. How does our protection or support of other individuals' rights affect our rights? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. And so, the Adventist Church was asked to join a coalition with a lot of other religious organizations, which we did, that started looking at, listen, is there a path forward that isn't winner take all, that recognizes that gays and lesbians and transgender individuals, LGBT individuals, do suffer discrimination in the workplace and the secular workplace, and that's not necessarily right and isn't right. And that's been in Adventist Church's statements for a long time. That people, just because they're gay or lesbian or transgender, shouldn't be subject to scorn, ridicule, and just harassment and bullying, for lack of a better term. And so we're like, well, how can we give protections that are needed in the secular workplace, which doesn't violate the Adventist belief? Seventh-day Adventists have certain beliefs in morality and sexuality, but we don't believe that individuals who don't follow those aren't entitled to a job or a living or to be full participants in society. We do believe, though, that the Adventist Church and other religious organizations should be able to, in conducting its mission, maintain the hiring standards and its standards of conduct as it sees fit. But if a person happens to work, at a Kia factory, in Montgomery, Alabama, that doesn't mean that they should, be fired just simply by their employer just because they're gay. And so we started to look at this, and so we spent about 4 years drafting up Fairness for All, which is a comprehensive bill that doesn't just impact employment, but all other different aspects of gay and lesbian rights in American society, and that balance these interests. And leadership voted this, both General Conference and North American Division. It wasn't something that was done lightly, and it was something that was taken very seriously and looked at over a very long time period. But at the end of the day, we felt that this was a legislative approach that both did not require us to compromise our religious beliefs in any way, but also allowed us perhaps to get stronger religious liberty protections in the United States. Kagi, I think he was pointing to you.
Okay. Another question on the menu is, what is the stand of the LGBTQ right to marry, and how will it affect our denomination?
So obviously in the United States and a lot of other Western countries, gays and lesbians do have the right to marry. That's been in existence in Canada since the early 2000s. The United States found same-sex marriage, legal nationwide in 2015. with a case called Obergefell. The impacts on the church have been, I think in issues like we're talking about now, like employment and so forth, and how does that intersect? It does not mean Adventist pastors have to perform same-sex marriages. They don't, and they are not required. They don't, and no one's really challenged that they don't have to. No one's tried to sue us over that, and no one's filed any complaints or anything that we're not performing same-sex marriages or conducting them in our churches. So sort of the direct issue, hasn't been a problem, but it's all these sort of collateral issues that have come up. And issues like employment and issues like benefits and issues like public accommodation and so forth. It creates an issue for it especially when we try to work in a secular workspace. But it hasn't meant that Adventist pastors in any capacity have been required to perform same-sex marriages, and they're not.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you, Todd. Todd, a couple of years ago, back during our President Obama, he began allowing in the military for transgenders and also same-sex individuals to continue performing and working in the military. The question is regarding ministers such as in the Catholic faith, even in the Muslim faith, Orthodox Muslim, and even Adventist, mainline Bible-believing churches that object and do not see this as a true form of marriage. Now, you have these pastors, these chaplains working for the government and under orders to perform marriages. What if one refuses? What if they accept and they fall in conflict with their denomination, whatever that is, or they're running foul of the government, of their standing orders? What happens there?
So, and I am familiar with this issue. I'm actually also legal advisor to Adventist Chaplains Ministry. So I've been on the committee that endorses our chaplains in the United States military and also our General Conference endorsing agency for a number of years. And I can tell you, the Adventist chaplains in the U.S. military and other places don't perform same-sex marriages, nor are they required to. The military has a long-standing policies about conflicts between the ecclesiastical endorsing entity and the U.S. military. And the basic rule is that a chaplain is never really required to do anything that violates his or her belief system and the denomination that they're in. So, for instance, a Catholic priest does not have to give communion to a non-Catholic. Adventist pastor or a Catholic priest doesn't have to perform a same-sex wedding or so forth. Now, and so there is no requirement that an Adventist pastor or any pastor perform a particular wedding, a wedding service. Now, our chaplains are required and do, and have been doing this well before, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, minister and provide support to same-sex individuals in the United States military. So they provide the same chaplaincy support services they would provide to anyone, regardless of faith or no faith, and they provide that to same-sex individuals, and that's not a problem. It doesn't violate their requirements as an Adventist. We minister to all, and it's consistent with their military oath. Of course, however, part of their ministry to the same-sex attracted individuals in the military is not performing marriages, and so they don't do that and aren't required to.
Is there a law that requires or permits same-sex partners to share in the health benefits of the employed partner?
So yes, there is in the United States, generally speaking, that requirement. The Adventist Church, for its benefit of its employees, does not provide this. Most for Adventist entities that and I'm not talking about our hospital systems, but for the Adventist entities that our schools, our conferences, and so forth, they generally require those individuals to be Seventh-day Adventists themselves. And therefore, that we wouldn't recognize as same-sex marriage, and generally don't provide health benefits on the ecclesiastical side to same-sex couples. Generally speaking, because that violates our conduct standards, those individuals aren't, generally speaking, eligible for employment anyway.
Thank you, Pastor.
Yeah, So some people want to know where are these questions coming from. These questions are coming from individuals within the Seventh-day Adventist Church and outside. They come from Muslims. We have atheists. We have pro-LGBTQ, and we have on the other side, we have Jews. We have atheists. We have all types of individuals, employees of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and pastors who are non-denominational. They've all sent in these questions, quite a few. We did send them to Todd so he can see them a little bit ahead of time and prepare for these questions, but we're voicing them on your behalf. Now, here's one about the General Conference session. In 2015, there was an attempt from some delegates from Europe to introduce LGBTQ reforms to our church manual. Even now, we see in some publications a call for the Seventh-day Adventist Church to rewrite their manual to accept LGBTQ and LGBTQ issues and marriages and the like. What can you say regarding that possibility in this new GC session that's happening right now?
Yeah, so our General Conference session is scheduled now for May of 2021. It should have been done by now, but thanks to COVID, it got continued. I should be taking a vacation somewhere right now after session, but instead, like everyone else, stuck at home. There was a motion on the floor of the General Conference session to recognize same-sex marriages. That went nowhere. It's not contrary. It's not consistent with the church's biblical understanding, and it's not consistent with the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and got very little, if hardly any, support. I can't remember what the exact vote was, but it was overwhelmingly voted down. Our church's stance on these issues, both in our church manual, our fundamental beliefs, and our statements, is pretty clear. I don't think there needs to be any clarification to that. And to the best of my knowledge, and I have looked at most of the stuff that's on session, including church manual, there really isn't planned for any more clarification. And that's not because quite frankly, because it's not needed. It's pretty clear as it is right now.
This next question is rather lengthy. It's broken down into several parts. In the context of Bible prophecy, how do we interpret the recent Supreme Court rulings of greater funding of parochial schools and state funds, parochial school teachers?
I don't want to cut you off there. Why don't we kind of go through this one at a time rather than all at once? Why don't you just kind of break all those up?
Okay.
And maybe we can switch between them, between yourself and Pastor.
Okay. In the context of Bible prophecy, then, how do we interpret the recent Supreme Court rulings on the subject of greater funding of parochial schools with state funds?
Right. So there was a recent Supreme Court decision called Espinoza that addressed this issue, and there was one before dealing with Trinity Lutheran. In both of those situations, what had happened was the government had created a program for schools. In the case of Trinity Lutheran, it was a rubber tire recycled material for playground safety. And in the case of Espinoza, it was a credit or a scholarship program, I should say, through its tax system for parochial schools. But in both of those situations, while parochial and private schools generally were available, it wasn't available to religious schools. And the challenge was, and what the Supreme Court said was that, listen, if you're going to make something generally available and you're going to open it up to any school, you can't exclude religious schools from that. And that's what the U.S. Supreme Court said. Now, the Adventist Church's stance on taking these kind of funds has been varies. It's a sort of a balancing test. Some schools are comfortable taking some money, some are not comfortable taking it. But that is sort of where the church is there. But this was really about non-discrimination against religious schools, I think is how the best to look at those two decisions.
So we're still looking at it in light of Bible prophecy, and I have to address this. The Seventh-day Adventist Church sees Revelation 13 as a future view of a one world government, one world economic system, and one world religion. Having said that, how does the stance of the United States Supreme Court seeing parochial school teachers as ministers How is that not an infringement? Vice versa, not.
Yeah,
What is that?
right. And so the question, I alluded to this before when I was talking about Bostic. You got to understand generally, so in the United States and really all Western countries, in fact, most countries around the world, there's various laws that deal with employment discrimination, what employers can and cannot do to with their workforce. And those vary a lot about what the restrictions are. And that generally applies to secular employers, but you can understand that in a particular context, that perhaps the government shouldn't be interfering in that workplace. And maybe the clearest example of that would happen to be with, just pick a Catholic priest. So generally speaking, we talked about Bostic before and Title VII and the law that says that you can't discriminate on the basis of gender or sex. But obviously the Catholic Church doesn't recognize female priests. They just don't do that. And how do you square the fact that you couldn't do that with any other job, but the Catholic Church can, hire only male priesthood? And the answer is, in the U.S. Supreme Court has said, is something called the ministerial exception. It's an exception to the civil rights laws that says, listen, the right of a church, including the Catholic Church or the Adventist Church, to hire pastors as it sees fit, is really circumscribed by the First Amendment, and that right, the right of the church to pick who teaches and preaches its gospel, supersedes another person's right to not be discriminated against on these bases. And so, what the recent Supreme Court decision, a case called Our Lady of Guadalupe, said was that it's not only the priest that gets up, on Sunday morning, that stands, and does mass, or the Adventist pastor who gives the sermon, but also applies to teachers. And that had been decided a few years ago in a case called Hosanna Tabor. And this was really just kind of a follow-up on that, where these were grade school teachers that were teaching religious subjects, leading the kids in prayer, taking them to chapel, etc., and whether or not they counted as ministers for terms of the ministerial exception. What the Supreme Court said they did. And I think this really this strengthens the religious liberty stance of religious organizations, Adventists, and generally, because what it says is they're not going to be second guessing, who we choose to have teach the faith in Adventist grade schools or high schools.
In the same general overarching question in the context of Bible prophecy, how do we interpret the recent Supreme Court rulings with respect to the loss of tax exemption if we don't comply with LGBTQ marriages? And Bob Jones University is cited as an example.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, Bob Jones was not a recent case. It was a case from the 1980s. And that case was one where Bob Jones University, which is a higher educational institution, prohibited students from dating, interracial dating on its campus. So if you were Black, you couldn't date someone who was white, and well, vice versa. And so that was the prohibition. And what the Supreme Court said, so the IRS came up with a rule, just a regulation, that said that violated public policy, and you couldn't keep your tax-exempt status if they maintained that policy. And the Supreme Court, in the 5-4 decision, if I remember correctly, said that was constitutional. That in that situation, being higher education, that the right of getting rid of racial discrimination superseded the right to a tax-exempt status. Now, interestingly, what the law didn't do was simply require them to, or prohibit them from having the policy. It just says you don't get your tax-exempt status. When Obergefell was argued, and this was during the Obama administration, one of the questions that was asked at Verrilli at the podium was, well, if churches won't perform same-sex marriages, could they lose their tax-exempt status? If schools don't recognize those. And he said that was an issue that would have to be litigated. So there's certainly people that are worried about that. I don't think there's the votes in the Supreme Court to do that, and that case hasn't really been brought yet for a number of technical reasons. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. It's definitely something that could be a threat. In fact, one of the advantages of fairness for all, if it were to pass, is it makes it clear that the IRS can't do that. That just because you maintain a traditional view of marriage doesn't mean you lose your tax-exempt status. But it is something that is out there. However, I don't think we're in imminent fear or danger of that happening in the near future.
The Seventh-day Adventist Church has one of the largest private schools in the world. And as such, we are subject to accreditation by the local governments that we have, our students and our teachers. And how is it possible, or is it possible, that we can lose our accreditation, and what that would mean for a school to lose its accreditation for refusal to teach evolution or LGBTQ or any other social issues that go against our norms?
Sure. So just a little bit of explanation for those who may not be familiar with how higher education, at least in the United States, works in accreditation. So accrediting bodies are private organizations. They're not government entities, at least they're not considered that, and they are private organizations. And they provide an accreditation. All that simply says is this is a school that meets certain standards. And what that you don't have to have an accreditation to run a school, but it's really a lot of advantages come with it. And as a practical matter, our schools would have a hard time staying open without accreditation. And the reason for that is for really anything other than, say, teaching, preparing pastors, you've got to be accredited, for instance, to participate in the federal student loan program and federal aid and grants and so on. You also need to go to an accredited institution if you want to go to higher education. So, I went to Southern Adventist University, which is an accredited institution, and then I went to law school. Had I not graduated from an accredited college, the University of Illinois, where I went to law school, wouldn't have accepted me. And that's the same way for, medical schools. It's the same way for other graduate institutions. And then, like I said, to get advantage of federal aid, you also need to have to be accredited. Right now, federal law actually protects our higher education institutions, and they're not required to teach in a way that's inconsistent with their system. The Higher Education Act of the United States says that these private accreditors can't refuse accreditation because the school adheres to its beliefs of its sponsoring organization. And I should say, even though these are private organizations, these accrediting bodies, the reason that they have the power they do is because the federal government gives it to them and recognizes them as an accreditor. And so it ultimately is the government that sort of has the say on that because of the funding issue, and then also, like I said, the ability to sort of use that degree for higher education beyond that medical school, law school, whatever. And so right now, written into federal law is protections for our institutions, and our institutions, well, I should say they do teach evolution in our institutions. They just simply teach it in a way that's consistent with our Adventist beliefs. And the same thing, for gay and lesbian students, which, by the way, every one of our higher education institutions in the United States has gays and lesbian students. And those students are encouraged and supported to attend Adventist education, and we want them there. There are, however, conduct standards that is expected to be followed, and many of our students in our higher education institutions uphold those standards. They are young adults, and of course, like anything else, maybe not always 100% perfect, but again, we have gays and lesbian students in our higher education institutions. We want them there. They're welcome. They just simply have the conduct standards that are expected to be followed. And so far, right now, that hasn't caused a problem with our creditors.
Forced vaccinations.
Yeah. So the Adventist Church's stance on vaccinations, which we can provide, is that the Adventist Church itself is in favor of vaccinations. We believe them to be a public good and a public health good, and encourage people to take them. I myself have been vaccinated against more disease than I even knew existed. Back when we were allowed to do such things, I traveled quite a bit internationally. If you go to certain parts of the world, for instance, West Africa, you are going to get vaccinated against almost everything. And so I've taken that, and they provide the flu shots each year, the General Conference, free of charge to its employees. And there really isn't a basis under Adventist church teachings to oppose vaccinations. That's just not the position of the church, or as it's generally been understood. Having said that, certain individual church members, choose to, may have an objection to it for religious or other reasons. And it really is often other reasons when you really when you really push people who are opposed to vaccinations, at the end of the day, I have yet to have a conversation longer than just a couple of minutes with a person opposed to vaccinations, in which at the end of the day, they're really opposed to it based on medical grounds, not religious grounds. But the Adventist Church does support individuals, even if they have that sort of idiosyncratic belief. We historically have not really supported those people directly in litigation. We've supported some in the direct litigation, but certainly Adventists have applied for and gotten exemptions based on their religious belief. But it's their personal belief, not the church's belief.
Currently, quite a few parents are concerned about prosecution, litigation regarding their children's ability to be sexually reoriented, sexual identity, supporting them or not supporting them, bringing them to the pastor, counseling them against the LGBTQ lifestyle. What can you say about religious liberty and that stance?
Sure. So, conversion therapy is not something, well, the Adventist Church did back in the 80s have a program that attempted to get individuals who were gay or lesbian to sort of become straight. The Adventist Church doesn't really believe that's effective anymore. And individuals who want to, who are gay and lesbian, the Adventist Church certainly calls upon them to live godly lifestyles. But we don't encourage or advocate or have programs for conversion therapy as it's generally been understood, which is to change a person's sexual orientation. We believe that to be pretty well fixed. How that gets there, of course, can be a matter of debate, whether it's nature or nurture or some combination thereof. But the fact that by the time a person gets to adolescence and so forth, it's fixed is given, is taken. However, that doesn't interfere with a pastor's ability to work with a young person and to try to encourage them to live godly lifestyles and to uphold and adhere to the church's standard. And that's really not been impacted by any of the legislation that's been out there. The only legislation impact really is on trying to get a person to change their sexual orientation. Some of the language is a little bit broad and could be pushed to interpreted sort of, if you look at it from the right lens, as sort of interfering with the ability to sort of keep a person from practicing or engaging in same-sex behavior. That doesn't really apply to pastors. All those legislation really applies to licensed counselors in their counseling role. But again, I think where the Adventist Church's focus has been with its young people and not so young people is trying to encourage them to uphold the church's standards, as opposed to trying to get them to change their sexual orientation. And that really does seem to be something that isn't supported by our understanding of how humans work, and including from Adventist and people of faith healthcare providers.
Homeschooling.
Yeah. So, in the United States, and, this varies around the world, homeschooling is pretty protected, has a very strong protections. There's something called the Homeschool Legal Defense Fund, which actually we're working with on an issue right now that's sort of related. And they have advocated for both in the courts and really through legislation in the various states to give a lot of protections to homeschoolers. The Adventist Church itself, of course, runs its schools and Adventist schools. And so that's where we think Adventist young people should be. And that's where we encourage, our people to send their kids. However, some choose to send them to do homeschooling, including some very close friends of mine. And in the United States right now, homeschooling is really strongly protected. Ironically, there was an article a couple months ago in Harvard Magazine that sort of attacked homeschooling on a number of bases. That had a lot of sort of backlash, quite frankly. And for the foreseeable future, I don't see homeschooling having a lot of problems. Homeschoolers on average do very well in school and so on, and are generally sort of, I think, especially nowadays, sort of, generally speaking, well regarded, and certainly have gotten into a lot of top schools and everything. So it's not an issue that I think, at least in the United States, has been a problem. Now, Europe can be a lot different. Germany, I believe, just complete out and out bans it, and other parts of Europe have severe or significant restrictions on it. To the best of my knowledge, it hasn't been an issue for our church members there. It's not something that we've had a lot of inquiries on and a lot of interest in and pushing back on.
let's talk about freedom of speech and censorship, political correctness. Currently, Facebook and YouTube and some other multimedia sites, internet media sites, are restricting or taking down certain sites that they feel objectionable. Before, a couple of years ago, decades maybe, I remember some radio and television stations taking down ministers who would speak against, at that time, LGBT communities, lifestyle, and the such, and they would take them down because they objected to what they were teaching. What is the state of freedom of speech, freedom of religion? What is the current state of that in this new climate?
So yeah, it is an area that is concerning. Social media websites like YouTube, like Facebook, like Twitter. I mean, those are the big ones. Are private entities, and so the First Amendment, generally speaking, doesn't really apply to them. So they are free to, have what they would like or even what they would not like on their platforms. And so while the government can't prohibit a pastor or a teacher or a person from saying certain things, with some narrow exceptions that we won't talk about really, these private entities can and do. None of them give protections that fully extend to the First Amendment. They all will take down certain content that has First Amendment protections, but they don't want on their platform. And right now, Facebook especially is under a lot of pressure right now because of what's viewed as hate speech and discriminatory speech, and really to suppress certain speech on their platform. Now, this has not generally speaking been religious, the concerns right now, and certainly not Adventist speech. This has been attacks on people because of their race, their ethnicity, certain attacks on, certain social justice movements like Black Lives Matters and so forth. It has been sort of where the pushback has been right now. So those entities, though, have a lot of say and a lot of ability to decide what they want to put on their platform or not. And there's very little protection, either constitutional, which is virtually none, or statutory there. Right now, I think we're streaming to Facebook right now, and I don't think anything we've said here would be viewed as problematic. And, Adventist pastors and others participate, as do a lot of range of religious organizations and so forth on these media sites. But is it possible that, that in the future, certain things that, in certain held and expressed beliefs be viewed as hate speech? And the answer to that is yes. It is very possible. The Adventist Church, believes that marriage should be between one man and one woman. Right now, it's perfectly acceptable to say that if it's done in the correct way, on these social media platforms, and generally does not mean that the content will be taken down. But could that change in the future? It might. I think it's one of the reasons why we have to maintain a robust protection for our beliefs and the freedom to speak. But yes, I mean, the social media platforms are under a lot of pressure, a lot of financial pressure, boycotts and so forth, to sort of restrict the speech on their sites. And just to be clear, some of the speech, that is being criticized and so forth really is, pretty over the top and not something that I think any of us would be comfortable saying ourselves. But the question is to what extent do we protect speech that we find abhorrent because we believe in a robust dialogue and discussion? And that's, an issue that we're dealing with as a society right now. And I'll be quite frank, I don't think a lot of the advocates have gotten that balance correct. They view some of the speech, while abhorrent, as being harmful, and it very well may be. And they believe that because it's harmful, that it should be suppressed and not allowed to be heard, or at least heard widely. And that's a tough balancing act to do.
Moving off of that series of questions, there was a SCOTUS ruling reportedly from California to the effect that government can limit church attendance while allowing Walmart, Home Depot, etc., and protesters to gather in large numbers. If that's the case, is the SDA Church doing anything about that?
Yeah, so there have been a lot of challenges to restrictions on churches in the United States and around the world. The short answer right now is the Adventist Church, to the best of my knowledge, no local Adventist churches have asked. They certainly haven't asked the division or the General Conference, nor have they on their own sort of challenged any of those. Our Adventist churches have, generally speaking, been compliant with those. have opened up and sort of tried to follow the rules the government has implemented. Pastor this morning when I was watching being in the sermon, there's a whole introduction there about what the rules were and wearing masks and social distancing and and how it's done. And so the Adventist Church is generally, at least for the meetings in its congregation, has been complying and has not found those at this point to be discriminatory or something that we've challenged in court. There's a couple of issues there that question raises. The first is the comparison to Home Depot and to Lowe's and and grocery stores and so forth. And the courts have, including the U.S. Supreme Court, have said that those are really different. Now, whether that's true or not, I'm not an epidemiologist, but they've said that, listen, people sitting for an hour or so in a congregation singing or whatever is a greater level of exposure than going to a grocery store and being there for a few minutes and staying socially distant and everything and not interacting and so forth. And so the courts have found there to be a difference there. Where I think the courts have and this has been struck down. And I think, I think there's another question coming on. I think the next question probably deals with the idea of protesting and being outside and so forth. So maybe I'll leave that right there, which is to say, we're following this, we're keeping a close eye on it. But right now, the Adventist Church in and of itself has not brought any challenges to any of these restrictions.
All right, great. Now we have quite a few, we're moving forward pretty quickly. And thank you for your time, Todd. All right. So we cannot address what individuals may or may not say that we don't agree to. If the church were to respond to every one of those comments, I guess we would be tied up forever. But let's talk about what appears to be some type of, I don't know, some message, not a single coherent message. Much like what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
you're talking
about the New York City situation.
Right, but not only them, California did the same thing.
Oh, no. And there has been, so just to give some background here, early on in the pandemic, there was a number of times in which individuals were trying to, in one situation, there was a funeral that had a lot of individuals in a particular Hasidic community. A long revered leader there had died, and they had met, and there was hundreds, if not 1,000 there. And so individuals were there for that funeral and were outside. We're not social distancing or anything. And the police showed up and dispersed that crowd. And as the question did accurately said, the mayor himself, de Blasio in New York, sort of took charge of this and dispersed them and really was very, very critical of the Hasidic community there that did that. I will also say he got some pushback as well. In addition to that, there were different organizations and groups that afterwards wanted to protest the lockdowns and so forth, including in California. They applied for a permit. They were denied. They went to the Court of Appeals. They were said, no, it's too dangerous. You can't protest. There were other protests in other parts of the country that did occur, and people were heavily criticized. And this was dealing with the lockdown and said, no, this is dangerous and you can't be out there. And you need to protest in ways that aren't, outside or physically together with people. And then the George Floyd situation happened, in which he was tragically died while being arrested, and the I can't breathe, and the neck, 8 minutes and 46 seconds or whatever. And that started, and there was, of course, a number of events leading up to that as well, but that seemed to be the catalyst. And then there was a lot of protests, huge protests around the country. Majority of them peaceful, but not all of them peaceful. Minneapolis downtown was just decimated with fires and looting and so forth, and that certainly happened in other parts of the country as well. But what was interesting was the reaction of political figures to that was not to tell the protesters that this was dangerous from a public health perspective and they needed to stop, but rather actually to join them to say that this was important. To say that this was more important than COVID. In fact, epidemiologists, there was a letter about 1,300 health providers that sort of took the same approach. And it really did show, I think, what was huge hypocrisy, which was that a value judgment was being made here, that the funeral, that the protesting of the lockdown, that did not deserve robust First Amendment protections, or those First Amendment protections could be limited in the name of public health. But when it came to this other issue, Black Lives Matter and so on, that took superseded any public health concerns and just couldn't wait. And I want to be very careful here. not being critical of these social justice movements and their right to protest. What I think was highly inconsistent was the governor's response to this, which was one of them was okay and recognized and encouraged and joined with, and the other was condemned and denied. And that just really is hard to square with. And in fact, there was recently in New York a judge that recognized that and struck down some restrictions that the government's put in place there. And I do think that this was a situation where that happened, that the government just sort of overstepped its bounds, and they're being held accountable for that with lawsuits and so forth in our judiciary. I mean, to me, the perfect example of this is one of the cases, and this is what I alluded to before. They wanted to protest in Sacramento outside the governor's mansion in the state house there on the lockdown, and they applied for a permit from California Highway Patrol, which was the one that controlled that space. They said, no, you can't do that. It's illegal. It's unsafe, and we're not giving permits because of public health concerns. And this is a reasonable restriction on your First Amendment rights, and we're not going to do that. And it was upheld by the court. And then a couple weeks later, there were people out there protesting in the exact same spot, and the state did not enforce their prohibition. Those people, those groups did not even have to apply for a permit or did not apply for one. There was no attempt by the California Highway Patrol to enforce the prohibition on protesting without a permit. And in fact, the governor encouraged that and joined in various circumstances. And yes, that is a problem. And even sort of the most sort of liberal, so to speak, and attorneys I spoke with, I have yet to find anyone who, from a legal perspective, has really been able to defend that, and that has been a problem.
But regarding that California, that same governor prohibited Christian churches or any church from singing and singing during their church services. Was that an infringement on the free exercise thereof?
Yeah, so the prohibition, of course, was on singing indoors and so on. And the basis for that, the medical basis for that is there seems to be some evidence now. How accurate this is, and this seems to have been from a couple anecdotal evidences where there's some choir practice early on, in which I think in some place in California, I'm forgetting where right now, in which a lot of the individuals after that came down with COVID. And so the belief had been that this was because of singing and the way respiration works and, getting airborne and so forth. The singing indoors is a particularly problematic and way to spread COVID. So that's been the medical. And again, that seems to have some medical support. On the other hand, you're talking about a couple of situations and anecdotes and, how much, this has not been replicated and sort of controlled, randomized, studies yet and so forth, because we don't fully understand how it works. And so, that restriction on indoor singing and so forth is a little bit different than outdoor activities. However, again, there was singing and during the protests and so forth, and that was allowed. And there does seem to be a significant amount of inconsistency here based upon the message. If it's a message the governor, especially liberal governors, like or support or feel like they have to support politically, there's going to be basically a pass given to that, and it's going to be important. And if it's something that doesn't come from their base or the constituency, and that certainly covers for a Democratic governor in California, then there seems to be much more willingness to sort of go on the public health side. I want to be very careful here. I don't think this is Governor Newsom just trying to really crack down on religions. I mean, I do think that he believes truly, that he honestly believes, I should say, that singing in churches causes a public health concern. My criticism of the governor is that he doesn't take that same willingness to crack down on First Amendment rights and apply that to groups such as Black Lives Matter that he politically supports. He needs to be consistent. And if he's going to restrict the rights of one organization, he has to do that to his friends as well. And there's just been a complete hypocrisy there and unwillingness to do that. And that is a problem.
We're coming to a short series of questions with regard to the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And one question is, why are some rights more protected, or at least more apparently protected than others, when both are protected, at least nominally, by the same UN declaration?
Yeah, and the answer to that is that certain rights, over time become more popular and are viewed just by society and by judges as being more important. And so right now, LGBT rights, when they come in conflict with religious rights, are generally viewed as taking precedent. We'd have to talk about the different situations there, but the way it's generally viewed is that, they usually is put in terms of third-party harm. That you have the right to believe as you see and to worship as you believe, but as soon as you try to do something that causes a harm to a third party, such as a gay or lesbian person, then your rights stop. And so that's generally sort of the legal rubric that's used. The problem, of course, that is that there's never viewed as third-party harm for the rights that LGBT individuals might express. So, for instance, take the employment context or the context of public accommodation. We'll take Masterpiece Cake Shop. They're viewed there that Jack. I'm not forgetting his last name right now, but Jack, the owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop, he refused to bake a cake for a same-sex couple for their wedding, and that was viewed, while the Supreme Court ultimately upheld and ruled in favor of him, that was viewed by the LGBT community as being wrong because it imposed a third-party harm, that he didn't have to believe in same-sex marriage, but that he couldn't impose that belief, as the words were being used, on this couple. The problem with that third-party harm analysis is there's no reciprocity there. There was no accounting for the fact that forcing him to bake a cake that he felt was against his belief caused him harm, was imposing the couple's belief in a system on him. And so that's where I think that the breakdown becomes is that it's only a one-way street, that there's never a harm on the person of faith. It's only on a harm of the group that is most favored. And there's no question, I think, that, especially among certain elitist institutions, that there's picking of winners and losers. And if you're in the sort of favored winner category, then your rights, trump. And that's, just kind of the way things are working right now.
National Review reported that the United States Supreme Court sometimes looks at international law when making decisions. In light of that, does the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights trump all other national laws? Could that be a possibility coming down in the future?
Well, what happens in the future, I am not a prophet nor the son of a prophet. Right now, I can tell you that it does not. It certainly does not in the United States. Certain Supreme Court justices, a minority of them, quite frankly, will look to international law for some guidance. Even the most liberal of justices do not believe that the UN Charter and so forth trump United States law. It's United States law. What they might do in certain circumstances is look to international law for some guidance about norms and how to interpret U.S. law. Whether that's appropriate or not would be a topic of a whole different discussion. But right now, international law does not, in the United States at least, trump law. I will say there are some other impacts and so forth in certain treaties and so forth, especially in the Court of the Americas, in which they do purport to override national laws and so forth in countries other than the United States. Well, they might even purport to do it in the United States, but no one takes that seriously. How much that will happen and so on, I think is still being litigated. But yes, there are certainly certain international bodies that want to impose, the signatory countries and sort of hold them accountable in their national law. So that is something the international bodies would like to do. Their success at it so forth has been limited.
This next question is, can a person or country be sued to observe the UN Declaration of Human Rights? We know that in Europe, for example, there's a European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, and signatory or contracting states can be held to the fire by citizens. Is there any way that countries can be similarly held to task under the UN Declaration of Human Rights?
No, there's no similar enforcement mechanism in the United Nations. You're right, the European Court of Human Rights and other European courts do for their signatory countries, hold them responsible. And of course, then that's followed by the national countries to varying degrees. But the UN Declaration of Human Rights does not have a similar enforcement mechanism for it.
Well, you said that it doesn't have an enforcement. Therefore, that answers the question about anybody being arrested by the United Nations or anything else like that. How about the International Court? Do they have any authority?
Well, yeah. So the International Accord I'm forgetting the exact name of it right now, which the United States, by the way, is not a signatory to. They do have, with signatory countries, do have an enforcement mechanism, and to the extent those countries are willing to enforce, that's generally restricted to war crimes, and that does have an enforcement mechanism. The United States did not join that for reasons that I think may be obvious. Those are familiar with U.S. politics, because they did not want their soldiers to be held, to that. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, the U.S. soldiers have always done right, or the U.S. claimed they did. The United States has prosecuted, and there's U.S. soldiers in jail right now for committing war crimes. But they did not want an international body being the decider of that. They felt they could police that themselves.
I have to ask one more question because just so that way our viewing
Yeah.
audience knows we've really concluded all of them. But there was one series of questions, and I'll verse it this way. We have unique views on prophecy. They're unique now. Historically, they weren't so unique regarding Revelation 13 and even Daniel's prophecy regarding the king of the north and the south. How is Adventist view of prophecy not considered hate speech? Could it be possible that it would be considered hate speech and therefore banned in the future?
Well, I think you have to understand Adventist prophecy in its context. First of all, the term hate speech has a very undefined meaning, and means a lot of different things to different people. So it's hard for me to say, whether something is considered hate speech or not. That generally falls down to, does the person hearing it like it or not? And oftentimes things that we agree with are not hate speech, and things we disagree with are considered hate speech. But some of the elements of hate speech have been, isn't an attempt to, cause a particular group of individuals because of some characteristic, like their religion, to be, disliked, scorned, or persecuted, or, belittled. And Adventist theology does not hold that. We do have certain beliefs about what will happen during the end of times, but that doesn't mean that Adventists call for any religion, whether it be Muslim, Catholic, or otherwise, and for those adherents or practitioners to have their rights denied to them, to be discriminated against, or that those people themselves right now hold those views. I mean, remember, Adventist teachings on eschatology and end of time, no one is alive now when those teachings first became, and first, Ellen White talked about them. So they've never been intended to apply to a particular person or even to a particular time other than the end of time, which of course we don't believe we know when that is. And so the reason I don't think it constitutes hate speech is because we're not trying to use that to say, well, and then as a result of that, you need to do X, Y, and Z against any particular person or any particular religion. What it is a prophecy about the future, and that future has not come yet, and therefore there's no reason, and it would be highly inappropriate for any person to try to act on that against a particular person or faith.
Kagi, I think we've abused our guest enough for today. I think he has worked harder than usual, especially on the Sabbath. We really broke the Sabbath.
Yeah, no. This is more than I normally do on late on the Sabbath afternoon, but that's okay.
So Kagi, I'll leave you to tidy up here. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Pastor. I appreciate that. Todd, thank you very much for giving us so much of your time and your knowledge and your insights. They've been illuminating, enlightening, and a joy to listen to. All the best to you in the future.
Well, thank you for having me. It was great to be with you. And the next time that I get an invitation to speak, I expect to be able to come and see you in person and enjoy the island like I have in the past.
Absolutely. We'll work on that.
Thanks a lot.
Pastor, would you like to offer closing prayer?
Yes. I'm trying to work. I seem unable to work Zoom. Folks, we pray that this has been enlightening, informative. We intended to remove any doubt or any hearsay about what it is that we as Seventh-day Adventists believe. We know that there is a lot of false news, fake news out there regarding what we hold. I hope that this has been a blessing to you. I don't expect everybody to be happy, but that's the thing with religious liberty. Sometimes, in order to protect ourselves from the future, from what we believe the prophecy tells us, we have to defend others. I remind you of a saying that a Christian priest pastor said during World War II. Goes more or less like this: when they came after the Jews, I said nothing. When they came after the socialists, I said nothing. When they came after the industrialists and the communists, I said nothing. And when they came after me, nobody was left. Sometimes, in order to protect our rights, we also have to protect the rights of others.
Amen.
And that's what religious liberty is about. Why don't we bow our heads for a word of prayer? Father God, thank you. Thank you for faithful men and women defending our rights and the rights of others, even if we don't agree with what they're doing, but we do defend their rights. Lord, help us, Father, to help others, to be a blessing to others. And Father, come soon. In Jesus' name, amen.